Now I would like to turn the meeting over to Linda Buffo, who will introduce Brent Russell. Is he here now or?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, Linda.
Well, good evening, ladies. It is my distinct pleasure, personal pleasure, to introduce a friend of mine who I'm very proud to say is a member of our Petalumans of yesteryear, of which many of our women are members. Brent brings to our group an exciting representation of the architect Brainerd Jones. For those of you who don't know who Brainerd Jones is, you do know many of the buildings that he designed for our community in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Today, Brent Russell, our friend, is going to become Brainerd Jones for you, and he's going to give you Brainerd's story of how he designed many of the buildings in our city. Brent Russell has been involved in the design profession in the North Bay since 1989. The exciting thing for me is that Brent is doing the personification of an architect, and Brent himself is an architect. He's a licensed architect since 1996 and a graduate of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo with a Bachelor of Architecture and Master of City and Recreational Planning. He currently has his own business here in Petaluma under the name Studio 202. His work is predominantly in the North Bay with about 40% of the work in the Petaluma area. He does both residential and commercial design. Some notable projects that Brent has done include modifications to the beautiful First Presbyterian Church steeple at 939 B Street. He did an addition to the Petaluma Senior Center and a new house at 304 Fifth Street with an addition and remodel at 520 Walnut Street and a new house at 715 Bodega Avenue. All of these projects, when they're included in a historic district, make an architect's job even more challenging. At least 8 of his projects have received awards from the Heritage Homes Board. He currently portrays the character or the personification of architect Brainerd Jones as part of our group, the Petalumans of yesteryear. And now I'd like to turn this time over to Brent Russell, now known as Brainerd Jones.
And there's Brent. Okay, so Brent, you'd have to unmute, and I'm going to rename this as Brent Russell instead of your wife. Okay, we got that, and then I am making him the speaker view. Go ahead, Brent.
Well, for tonight, I am Brainerd Jones, and it's a pleasure to be with you. My wife, Jeanette, was a member of the Petaluma Women's Club many, many, many years ago. And I can tell you a little bit about that later in our discussion. Myself, I was born in Chicago in 1869. And, at the age of 6, shortly after my father died, my mother decided that she wanted to move west to be with other members of her family. So I came here as a 6-year-old, went to local schools, took drafting classes, actually won an award for industrial drawing. And shortly after leaving high school, I worked for a bookbinder and then later worked as an intern for an architecture firm in San Francisco. Spent several years there. And then in 1900, I decided to go out on my own and came back to Petaluma and set up shop. And at the same time, married my bride, Jeanette, who ultimately became a member of the club that you are all members of. Our wedding was simple. We had the wedding in her parents' house, and we honeymooned in San Francisco. But shortly after that, set up shop, started working on several buildings, and wasn't particularly set on a particular style. I worked with what seemed appropriate for the building and what was the client's interest, for that matter. And then we'll have some pictures a little bit later on showing some of the buildings that I designed around town, one of which you're very familiar with, of course, is the Petaluma Women's Club. The first major building that I was involved with is the Petaluma Library, now the Petaluma Historical Museum and Library. And that was, there was a competition to award the design to a particular architect, and I was chosen as the architect for that project. Also did another Carnegie Library in Healdsburg. But that building, we designed it to have a sense of strength and power and foreverness to it. So it's built in stone on the outside, but it's also built of wood as part of the structure. And that turned out to be fortuitous because shortly before it was finished, we had the 1906 earthquake. And unlike the damage that happened in Santa Rosa, because the soil conditions were better in Petaluma, and because the structure of the building is more flexible when it's made out of wood, it survived with only minor damage, and it only delayed the opening of the building approximately 3 months from when it was intended to be open. If you want more information about that, there's a whole presentation that the Petalumans of yesteryear did just on that building, and Linda Buffo can probably connect you up with some of that information if you're interested. I also have some information that I wrote down about that I'd be happy to share. But more in particular, the Petaluma Women's Club decided that they needed a new clubhouse, and they also had a competition. One of the contenders was Julia Morgan, who was probably, if not the most famous, one of the most famous local architects in the Bay Area, who later ended up designing Hearst Castle. She was a competitor. Realistically, I think I may have had a little bit of an inside track because my wife was a member of the club and I was a local architect, and I'm sure maybe a little bit more affordable than Julia Morgan. So I was awarded the contract to do that. At the time the building was designed in 1913, craftsman style was kind of a cutting edge style. And so that was chosen, obviously in consultation with the members of the club. And the other reason it was chosen, not just because it was kind of a cutting edge architecture, but craftsman style is kind of a homier style in a positive way. And it makes people feel comfortable and relaxed. And I think it's more appropriate for a group setting than, say, something like the museum, which almost feels like a governmental type building. And so that was chosen as the appropriate style for the organization to enjoy. And if you think about it, if you've been in some of the other craftsman houses around town in their original state, when you go in, you have that sense of hominess. When you go in the living room, and the interior of the building and the exterior of the building remind one of that, kind of home on a little bit grander scale, but not flashy in a negative way. The window style is not purely craftsman. It more reflects what's called the prairie style, which is a variation that popularized by Frank Lloyd Wright. And me as an architect, I'd like to borrow little bits and pieces from different architectural styles to give it a unique flavor. So if you look around town at some of my houses, you will see something that looks maybe craftsman-y, but there's kind of a little Asian roof flair to it. Or one of my popular features is to do dormers with double windows with X's in them. So, and also very fond of what I call the chalet style. And if you go up and down B Street, you'll see 3 or 4 houses of that style, where it's got a steeply pitched roof. And it's kind of a unique style of architecture you don't see frequently outside the Bay Area. There are some houses like that in San Francisco, but definitely there's several throughout the town of Petaluma. My wife and I, Jeanette, did not have children, unfortunately, but we were very involved in civic affairs. I was involved with Rotary. During World War I helped out with setting up shelters related to potential invasion. But after the war, was involved in even other social activities. One of them that was more memorable. There was a trade group that decided to get together with some people from Petaluma and some people from San Francisco. And we opted to go down to Mexico to meet with the president and visit and make some contacts to hopefully bring business to Mexico and vice versa. While we were there, we saw the sights, including the pyramids. And at one night, we had a little too much fun. And we were told afterwards, after we recovered, that we were like a bunch of jackasses. So when we came back, we decided to celebrate the time that we had, and we set up the Jackass Club, and I was one of the members. So that, that was fun. But in terms of my architectural work, since we're talking about the office I had, one building that you might find fascinating is there's this pink building. It's about 2.5 stories tall. It's on Washington Street. Right now, there's a business on the lower floor called Math Oasis. But it's a very distinct building, and the nice thing about it is there's kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for, penthouse on the upper floor. And this was the building that I built or designed to be not only my office on the ground floor, but also a place for Jeanette and I. And then we had an apartment that we rented to someone else. And it's kind of a really sweet building. And there was one feature that I designed into it where there's this little kind of hidden room behind my office where I could take quick naps in the afternoon in between meeting with clients. That's somewhat of a Spanish style. The building was built probably the early 30s, but the style of architecture that I have covers a lot of different styles. And I'm gonna ask Lynn Ann to bring up pictures 1, 2, and 3, just to give you some examples. The first one you'll notice is the Lincoln School, which is a brick building at the corner of B and 5th Street. And that's kind of a traditionally styled building. It was originally a school, and then it became the district office, and now it's offices.
That one, is that the school? What's that?
I am not seeing the picture of the building.
Okay, hold on. Okay, one moment.
That's okay.
Okay, so let's see. It should be, all right, this one. Okay. Okay. So this one. Right?
Are you going to be screen, Lynn Ann? Because I can't see that from here.
Okay. Okay. Can you, like I'm sharing the screen. Can you see the screen?
But not the picture.
Okay.
I
Okay.
can't- Is it that little yellow, blue square on the upper right-hand corner of your picture, or something that you click on to help everybody else see what you're looking?
There we go.
They're screen sharing. Yeah, that's it. There we go.
So that's the Lincoln School. And then you can see in the right-hand corner, the next building is what's referred to as the old post office. And then the next slide to the right is one of my later works, which is the Petaluma Fire Station, which is done in the Art Deco style. And that was done in the late 30s. The next picture to the right is the Martin Farmhouse, which is on Washington Street, now near what's known as Highway 101. And that was done in a craftsman style. The next building, which is showing prominently, that is the Petaluma Golf and Country Club Clubhouse. That was done in the late 20s. and it has kind of that relaxed style like you'd see in a rural country club. And then we have the Petaluma Museum is the next shot, which is at the corner of B Street and Kentucky.
Library. That's
Yep.
the library.
Yeah.
Is that the museum?
Well, it's a museum now, but yes, it's the Carnegie Library that I was speaking about earlier. And if you haven't had a chance to go in that building, it really is a beautiful building because there was a focus on creating natural light, and there's a nice glass dome at the center of the building that provides light not only to the lower floor, but to the upper floor gallery. And the land for that property was donated by Addie Atwater, who is also a character in Petaluma's A Yesteryear, and is buried at the Cypress Hill Cemetery. And one interesting feature about her, it's kind of a side note, she donated the land with the provision that if the building was ever changed from being a library, that her heirs got the land back. So that's why it still has a library within it, even though it's also a museum.
Interesting. Yeah.
The next building is at the corner of 6th and C Street, and is an example of a brick building. But you can see it's got tall windows. It's done in sort of a Moorish style, which you would find in Spain. And it has a big glass window wall in the back, which was unusual for this period of time in having kind of an open feel to the backyard. And then you probably recognize the next building.
Haha.
The Women's Clubhouse. And so here again, it's done, generally speaking, in what's referred to as a craftsman style, which the features on craftsman style are usually long overhangs, nice thick columns at porches. There's a feature that sticks out from the wall, the triangular wall that helps support the roof. Those are referred to as corbels. Oftentimes you'll find them, they even have a diagonal brace with them to add effect or to add support. What makes it slightly different than the typical craftsman is the choice of windows for the building. With the craftsman style, you would see maybe a pattern of horizontal windows, but in this, we created some high windows, which is actually in some respects more reflective of a modern type building, but it was something that would be found potentially on what would be referred to as a prairie style building.
I added one more. The current version.
There we go.
Okay.
Even prettier with the lights on.
Yeah. And the sign. So everybody knows who we are.
Right. And then the next street, the next property, and I'm trying to remember my address here, is also in Petaluma. Number 9.
No, I didn't get number 9.
Well, I think that's what it is. Oh, number 9 is the pink one. That's my office.
Didn't get it in the emails.
That's okay. This is 226 Liberty Street.
Mm.
So that's more of a traditional Queen Anne style, representative of some of my earlier work. And then the final picture is also, this is what's referred to as the columbarium. This is at Cypress Hill Cemetery, and it is done in Art Deco. Now, unfortunately, the original architecture that was on the other side, which is really the front of the building, got covered over in the probably 1970s as part of an extension. So the most obvious part of the Art Deco original style of the building is what you see from the back. I would encourage you, if you get the opportunity, to take part in the Petalumans of Yesteryear cemetery walk that they typically do in October. And this is one of the stops featured on that walk, because there's 2 or 3 pretty well-known Petalumans that are buried here, including Lyman Bice, who was very involved in the development of the egg incubator. But there's other famous Petalumans, and I'm sure at least 2 or 3 of them were members of the Women's Club that are buried in the cemetery. And various people in the group who represent different characters from the past, like myself, or get a chance to share their stories when we go on that tour. So I lived a pretty long life. I outlived my wife, interestingly enough, and I passed away in 1945, shortly after World War II, at the age of 76 from heart failure. And I'd had a heart condition for the last, 5 or 6 years of my life. Interestingly enough, even though I spent almost my entire life in Petaluma, I'm not buried at the Cypress Hill Cemetery. I'm buried at a cemetery in the East Bay. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. That's kind of the end of my formal presentation.
Very nice. Linda Buffo, did you like to say something? Yay, thank you. Thank you, Brainerd Jones, AKA Brent Russell, who I understand you also designed and were hired by Rosemary Hart, our board. She's a web designer, and she has a beautiful craftsman's home. And she's like, Brent Russell designed our place.
Yes, I did. And Anne, who is on, I designed her house as well. She's one of the ones that referenced in the bio.
And Anne Morante?
Yes.
Oh,
I recognize the address that you mentioned.
Yes. Well, it's a house we're both proud of.
Yes, I love it. You did a fabulous job for us.
Can I ask a question? Where did you say you were buried? I missed that.
I'll be honest with you. I don't know the exact cemetery, but I'm buried in the East Bay, so somewhere I think in the Oakland Hills. And I'm not sure what the connection was for choosing that as my burial place, but that's where I'm buried.
There's a fabulous cemetery in Piedmont. Yeah, I wonder if I should see if that's it.
Mountain View.
Mausoleum.
It's actually technically in Oakland, but it's called Mountain View Cemetery. It's just on Piedmont Avenue.
okay. Any other questions? Any other
Yes, I have
questions? Who's that? Who is that?
Sue Bunker.
All right, let me get you for speaker view. Okay. Okay.
Brent, can you recommend a good biography on your life?
There currently is no one to my knowledge who's written a book about me. There are various sources, and I can give those to you. So
I'll send it out in a, go ahead and give them, but then I'll send them out on a recap with this video.
sure.
And Montoya has done a good write-up on Brent. Brainerd Jones.
I did, when I was researching for this, I looked at Wikipedia as a starting point. Sean Montoya, who's actually another architect in here in town, has done a fair amount of research. He did it in conjunction with a gentleman who unfortunately slips my mind, who he was a client of mine, but he and Sean Montoya, and this gentleman also was the previous Brainerd Jones. They did some research more along the lines of houses that I did, and they provided that information to the Petaluma Historical Museum recently. I have not had a chance to look through it in any detail. There was an article published by Bill Hammerman in 2014 about Brainerd Jones. It's approximately 2 or 3 pages. And that is a reference. And then there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle in 2006 about Brainerd Jones. So those are the sources that I've been able to access.
And I have the article on 2006 in the Chronicle, and it was absolutely stunning. And I will send that out with this recording and the San Francisco 2006 synopsis, and anything else anybody wants. And we'll send that up.
If you would like to know some addresses on D Street, there is a tour that used to happen. Houses on D Street. I think Catherine Reinhardt did it, as a matter of fact. And so we have a list of houses on D Street that were designed by Brainerd Jones. So if anyone wants to follow up and have some fun doing a drive around, we can provide you with those addresses. He was a very, very prolific architect here. And as you can see, the styles of that, the range of styles of architecture that he did was phenomenal. Everything from Queen Anne's to the modern, more 1920s and late 30s Art Deco styles. Imagine the talent it took to be able to do buildings, design buildings with such a wide range of different features and end results. I mean, he was an amazing architect. So we're really grateful that Brent, as an architect himself, has chosen to represent Brainerd Jones and bring to it his expertise and knowledge. So we hope you enjoyed it. Anybody have questions for Brent? Brainerd? I would like, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I have a question, Susan here. What, unless I missed this, I'm curious about during that period, Brainerd Jones and Julia Morgan, did they compete for projects, or can you just say a little bit about that?
I think to some degree they were contemporaries, but Julia Morgan had a broader, I guess, geographical influence in terms of she operated, extensively around the Bay. Her home base was in the East Bay, and I think the predominant amount of her work is there, but I think her stuff is spread out all over the Bay Area. And of course she did Hearst Castle. They operated about the same time. I mean, to Julia Morgan's credit, she had more formalized training. She actually went to, a school of architecture, and being a female, she was pretty darn cutting edge in a man's world. And of course, she's best known for Hearst Castle, and he was a
high maintenance
client. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had stories. I've been to Hearst Castle, and they talked about the fact that it was done in concrete, which is nice and substantial. But the problem is when you make changes, it's expensive, and he was known to make lots of changes. And on a personal note, it happens. That's my biggest challenge the last 3 or 4 weeks is people making challenges in the field. But Brainerd Jones' work is mostly found in the North Bay. To our knowledge, there's very little stuff that he did outside of, say, Sonoma County.
No.
He did several buildings up in Santa Rosa. He did the Healdsburg Carnegie Library, but most of his work was probably within, 30, 40 mile radius of Petaluma. And so even though he and Julia Morgan were contemporaries, they, I guess you'd say, operated in different spheres of influence.
Did he live in Sonoma County?
Oh, he lived in Petaluma.
He did live here. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I don't know where his, first, second, or third house, but the final house he lived in is the building on Washington Street, and I'm forgetting the cross street at the moment. You can't miss it. It's the only pink 2.5-story building.
It's Liberty.
Yeah. Okay. Liberty.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I know that one.
It's when you really pay attention to the building, it's very unique. And in some respects, what I would say is cutting edge in the sense that that's the type of thing that planners and architects are trying to get communities to do, where you have a multi-use building downtown. And what's even more special about it is it really has a penthouse at the top, and it's got a yard and up there, and you can see that there's plants and stuff like that. It's like a little oasis in the downtown area.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else for questions? State your name so I can find you. All right, I'll ask a question, Brent.
Yes.
Lynn Ann here. So I was reading in the 100-year history of the Petaluma Women's Club, and it said that at one point when the building contracting started to happen for the club, that the 300, the 300 membership went down to 330 because the husbands at the time, which controlled the culture at the time, it was about doing what the husbands wanted rather than the husbands want to please the women. So all the women quit. So we had like, a 270 exit because the contractors that were being used, obviously Brainerd Jones was born in and lived in Petaluma, but what happened when something like they were hiring other contractors? Do you know about that?
That I don't know, and that would be a piece of information I would like to find out. This is what I suspect is, to your point, women spending a bunch of money on a project that in essence benefited women probably wasn't culturally supported.
Mhm.
I can tell you in the modern version as an architect, if the wife isn't happy, the job's not happening. My experience has been when I meet with couples that I'm either working with both of them or I'm working with the wife. And on the rare occasions where the husband's acting as the front man, and it's only happened probably 3 times, and one of the times it was cultural because they were from South Asia, it was pretty self-evident that the wife was really running the show behind the scenes. So that's where you can see what I'd say is progress between, when the Petaluma Women's Club building was built and what happened now.
1913.
But on the positive note, the library, which I was also involved with in my role as Brainerd Jones, that was almost entirely spearheaded by women, and the men at the city council were dragging their feet, but ultimately it's the women that ensured that it got done. And it was this woman, Addie Atwater, who lobbied Carnegie to provide money for the library.
Wow.
And Addie was a member of the Women's Club and a president, as a matter.
Yay.
And this isn't endorsed by anybody but myself. But if you guys ever decided you wanted to have a project to acknowledge one of your past members, Addie Atwater's grave is in a part of the cemetery that doesn't have upkeep. So she doesn't even really have much of a gravestone. So it would be great if at some point, maybe little bits and pieces of money were collected together to give her an adequate gravestone, because she
Linda Buffo, are we on this?
she was a mover and shaker, and
Yes.
it might be worth your while of having one of our colleagues. I hate it when I forget names. You know who I'm talking about, Linda.
Sherry Ortigan.
Yeah, yes. Sherry, have her speak to the group about Addie Atwater and all the impressive things she did.
Yeah.
I think it's time for us to do something. We'll get back to you on that. It's there's been many musicians and stars that had no gravesite, and current people step up to the plate to make that happen, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
And if this is something you pursue, I'd be willing to contribute some money towards it.
Oh, Linda, you got that?
I told him at the last cemetery tour.
Do you think there'll be a cemetery tour this year in October?
At this point, it's doubtful, but Linda and I had a discussion between the two of us about the fact that if the group size was limited to probably 8 to 10, it would be very doable because A, it's outside. You don't have to stand right close to each other to do it. Usually we do 2 groups of like 20 or 25. We'd have to break it up into, you know, more groups, but smaller. But since you're outdoors, you don't have to stand right next to each other to see what's going on. I think it's very workable. The only area that would be somewhat problematic would be going into the columbarium to see the where the 2 or 3 of the famous Petalumans are buried, but the exterior ones, you know, the mausoleums and the tombstones and stuff, that would be very doable. So if that's something that you think you would be interested in, lobby Linda and she can talk it over with the group.
Linda, put me on the list.
So for those of you who don't know what that is, the Petalumas of yesteryear, in their personas, go down to the cemetery and stand at the graves of their persona and then tell their story right there at their gravesite. It's not gruesome. It's in fact educational and historical, and it's a lot of fun. And you get to go from gravesite to gravesite. So you meet these characters and they become real. They actually come alive for a little bit of time. It's a great way to learn history.
And one of them's Mr. McNear, and I'm sure you're familiar with the McNear building downtown.
Mhm.
But you know, to add historical authenticity to it, we can show up in mass and pretend we're in the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic.
There you go.
There
I
is
was actually part of that one year, and Marshall had invited me, and it was really cool. I just absolutely loved it.
it's really fun.
You know, the first 2 years I did it, I just did my speaking part. This past year, I actually took the opportunity to go around as part of the tour in essence. And it, you know, I was familiar with some of the characters, but not to the same depth that I learned in doing the tour.
So I just want to point out one more building, Brainerd, if you don't mind, because I think it's a pretty exceptional thing. You are all very familiar with the McNear building and where McNear's restaurant is, and you're familiar with the theater that's attached to that building and the beautiful iron front building that it is. But Brainerd Jones was contracted to do an addition to that building. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brent.
No, that's accurate.
And that addition is a little more modern, but it fits in perfectly with the old McNear building. And I think that's a really fantastic example of architecture in Petaluma. And it's a fun one to take kids to or other people to point out an iron front building. And then next to it, a more modern adaptation of the adjoining building, and how well architecture can flow from one era to another if it's done right. And Brainerd Jones always did everything right as far as I was concerned.
Yeah. And, you know, that reminded me, another building that he did an extension to that you would probably all know is what was formerly the Line and Twine building. It's the brick building on Lakeville. It's now a hotel or a motel. But the original building was built in the 1890s, and then he did an extension to it about 15 years later.
So Brent, Lynn Ann here, tell us how, I mean, you're doing a beautiful job of reenacting Brainerd Jones. How do you reenact him in your current interior design architectural work?
You know, obviously not knowing the person personally, I would say the two things that we have in common are A, the vast majority of my work is in the Petaluma area. And the other thing that we have in common is we're not wedded to a particular architectural style. I mean, the one thing you'll find with some, quote, famous architects is they have a vocabulary that they use on every building that they do, and they don't really adapt to the client or the specific needs of the building, or are open to looking things at a variety. So you can see from the pictures, he did everything. I mean, he did the Queen Anne, he did the brick school, he did the extension to the Line and Twine building, he did this iron front that Linda mentioned, extension to the McNear building. He did Art Deco for the columbarium and the fire station. The Petaluma Women's Club is definitely an example of his in the craftsman style. So he didn't limit himself, and I think to some degree it shows that he didn't have a super whole lot of ego, because usually the people with the biggest egos are the ones that pick their style and they're not prepared to adapt to anything else. I would say, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright, to some degree, he did make some adaptation, but he felt within kind of his own modern style. You know, he was one of the progenitors of prairie style, and it adapted to something else later on when you get to Falling Water and when you get to the Marin Civic Center. And I kind of take that philosophy too. If I'm adding on to a building, I want the building to, or the vocabulary of the addition to fit with the style of the building. It's, to be honest with you, a little bit of an area of controversy in Petaluma, because what guides the planners in the city of Petaluma is they use the Department of Interior standards, and they're kind of along the lines of saying, you know, if I'm adding on to this building, I need to make the addition look like an addition. And they're not really worried about it being harmonious with the original architecture of the building. And I disagree with that. Because as to Linda's point, most people probably don't even notice that there's an addition to the McNear building, or there's an addition to the Line and Twine building. They work well together. And Marianne Hart, I mean, she can tell you, I mean, that house is very different than what was originally there, but it fits the neighborhood, and the architecture around the outside of the building is very integrated.
Awesome.
Brent, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
Who's
You're
speaking?
referring to that.
Who's speaking? Who's
Susan?
speaking?
Susan
Susan Hayes?
Price.
Oh, Susan Price.
Susan, well, hold on, honey. I need to get you in speaker view. There you go. Speaker view, baby.
Now I forget the question.
Uh-oh.
You've been referring to that beautiful brick building on Lakeville as Line and Twine, and for some reason, I thought it was a lace factory.
It was a silk factory.
Silk factory, yes. Linda's correct. It was a silk factory originally, then it became the Line and Twine building. They both worked with what I forget, in essence, cordage, but obviously on a finer scale. And one interesting piece of information about the company that was there in, quote, modern times actually made the connections that the astronauts used for doing spacewalks.
Nice.
What kind of connections?
They were ropes.
Well, you know, the cables, or the flexible cables that the astronauts use when they leave the ship, but are tethered to the ship when they're out doing a spacewalk.
And they made them at that building?
Yes.
They did them at that building, yeah.
Oh, wow. Cool.
There's all kinds of, what you'll find interesting about Petaluma is there's all these little pieces of historical detail that connect us to the larger country or the larger world. Lyman Bice and another gentleman who that most people think was actually the brainchild behind it, created the incubator, and that's what modernized raising chickens and eggs for, you know, what we use for food and et cetera. And
They sold like, I mean, Brainerd, AKA Brent, I think they were shipping incubators that were nationwide to the tune of like a huge number. Is it 1,000 a day or 1,000, 3,000 a week?
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
It was, my dad, who grew up in Santa Rosa, was riding the bus one time from the Bay Area up to his home in Santa Rosa. And the bus driver said, "Oh yeah, we're passing through Chickaluma." It was still known as kind of the egg basket of the world in the late 40s and early 50s. And you can see it with the barns and the old hatcheries around town. But, you know, the Line and Twine building and its connection to the astronauts, and, you know, the whole telecom boom in the 90s, part of that happened in the industrial parks at the northeast end of town with Mr. Bill White, whose son, Matt White, helped, you know, redevelop part of the downtown.
Right.
Well, I understand that Petaluma, from the history from Catherine Reinhardt, that it was one of the busiest ports, one of the busiest ports of the Northern California. So, I mean, that, like, it was okay, come out west and go to Petaluma. It's far from the city, but it's a very busy port. I mean, you gotta really think about that, you know?
Well, you know, in the 19th century, the easiest way to transport goods was by boat. And since Petaluma was on the Petaluma River, that's how they got things down to San Francisco. So most larger towns pre-20th century are on an oceanfront or on a river, if you really think about it. You know, London, Paris, New York, New Orleans. And it wasn't until, you know, the latter part of the 19th century that you started to see some other towns develop that weren't attached to the water, and that's because of the railroads. And probably the best example of that would be Atlanta. Atlanta has no, you know, major water body to be next to, but it got established because it was an intersection of different railroads, and that's really why it came about. But that's the advantage Petaluma had, and that's why it was bigger than Santa Rosa until the 20th century.
Nice. I have a question. Wait, Lynn Ann. Can find me. Let me find me.
That's okay. I can.
So I got a question. If you had to ask Brainerd Jones a question or about an information about something, what would that be? And I'm going to record you one moment and put you in. Okay. What would you, if you were having a conversation with Brainerd Jones, what would that look like?
Well, the two questions I would ask him is his experiences in dealing with clients, and see what was different or maybe what was the same. And the other would be, and I think I know the answer to this one, how it was dealing with government bureaucracy. Because I can pretty much assure you that the approval process for just about everything was substantially easier, you know, 100 years ago.
Okay, well, we'd have to see the letters that he wrote to family and friends to see if that was true.
Brent, are you an architect by any chance?
Yes.
Yes. I'm
You missed the first part.
Oh, I apologize.
No, that's okay.
Forgot about it. Then I couldn't find the invitation and yada, yada.
So just as a quick recap.
Well,
I moved here in 1989, partly because it was related to my wife's job opportunity. I applied for planning positions. I applied for architecture positions. I got 3 offers. I took one of them. I worked in Santa Rosa for 3 years. And then my wife was making, at that time, actually almost twice what I was making, which is fine. But I had one kid already, or we had one kid already, and we had this kid 2 was 2 and 3. They were twins. And it was cheaper for me to quit work and become a house dad than to have 3 kids in daycare. So I quit everything else and started working part-time for myself. As the kids got older, then I could get to working full-time, and that's how I did my business. So,
That's awesome.
yeah.
Brent, I got to say that's awesome, Lynn Ann here, that you gave the children a masculine upbringing, which is great because things are done on a schedule and this is how we do it. And I got to say, I love when husbands stay home. It creates so much structure and, yeah, that's a wonderful thing.
It was good. And my wife, with her job, at that time, traveled a fair amount. So she'd be gone for a week to Japan or South Korea or Australia. And so I, stayed home with the kids, and I jokingly told a story the other day to someone how it would be the day my wife's coming back and I'm telling the kids, hurry up, we got to get the house cleaned up for your mom.
Yay! Yay!
Brent, the reason I asked if you were an architecture, I was just wondering about some architecture in Petaluma that has always puzzled me.
Sure.
And that is down at East Washington and McDowell. On the corners there, they erected some kind of Art Deco, or I don't know what it is, Japanese. I mean, how did that come about? Who did that?
That was a city project. I don't know the details of it. I suspected what they wanted to do is, if you think about it in a contemporary sense, there's kind of two what I call retail commercial nodes in Petaluma. One of them is on the east side. The other's on the west side. The west side is obviously Petaluma Boulevard. The east side, it's predominantly around that intersection. And I think they decided they wanted to provide some sort of visual anchor to that intersection.
Right, but why that design?
This is the way to put it. That side of town, with a few exceptions, that side of town is pretty much post 1950. And so they picked an architectural piece that is, to some degree, it has an Asian influence, as you point out. It is a little bit what I would call postmodern. And I think it was put up probably, I'm speculating because I don't remember exactly when. It has kind of what I'd call a late 90s feel to it. And this is something that with observation, you'll start to pick up on it, but you can walk into a house and unless it's been physically updated, you'll get to the point where you can say, this house was built in the 80s. No, this house was built in the 90s. Oh, this house was built in the 2000s. Because houses, to some degree, like fashion trends, they don't change as frequently, but they go through style changes. And you can see it somewhat on the outside, but predominantly on the inside of the building. And I won't bore you with details now, but I could.
But that particular corner, it just has nothing to do with Petaluma. And I was
I don't think there was any intention to give it an identity that was Petaluma specific.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And if you want to discuss a really controversial topic about what represents or doesn't represent Petaluma, and Linda's smiling because she knows exactly what I'm going to say.
Yeah. Yes.
There's these dancing bathtubs that So I'm sure you guys can have a discussion about, does that really represent Petaluma or not?
Well, let's not.
Been there.
Right.
So, but what you find is, and architects are definitely guilty of this, oftentimes ego gets in the way of what they're designing, and it doesn't always fit in the neighborhood. And the other caution I will give you, when you look at a building and you see something and you don't like it, there's three guilty parties potentially. One of them is the architect, one of them is the owner, and the third one would be whatever bureaucracy approved or didn't approve it. And because sometimes you'll see something that's really nice, or it probably started out nice, and then either the owner decided to go cheap on his money, or the building department decided, oh, I don't know about this. I don't, it's not what we want. And I'll give you some examples. An example where someone cheaped out and the result wasn't great. There's a building at the end of B Street where it meets Petaluma Boulevard. It's kind of this angular building. It was built in the late 80s. It's stucco. I think it's changed colors recently, but it was beige. The story is that originally it was supposed to be brick to kind of fit in with the neighborhood. Well, during construction, the contractor and the owner, in order to save money, came to the city and said, oh, can we substitute stucco? Even though the building had been approved specifically with the intention of being brick. The building department said yes, it went stucco, so it became in huge contrast to what was there before. So that's an example of, someone being cheap. In terms of, the city of Petaluma, or like design review, I was at a meeting one time where something's just about ready to be approved, and at the last minute, one of the design review board members goes, oh, what kind of windows are you putting in this? Oh, well, we were going to do vinyl. He goes, oh, I hate vinyl windows. They're cheap. They're garbage. Da, 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 da. So there's got to be a condition, no vinyl windows. Well, at the time, there was no way the developer is going to put wood windows in this. So they put metal windows in, which even at that time were known as being inefficient. So this person who's on the design review board basically condemned everyone in that subdivision to having cheap aluminum windows instead of vinyl, which aren't expensive, but they're more thermally efficient. So
Apparently there's going to be some new construction on East Washington Street at, is it Liberty or
Yes.
apartment buildings or something? And I don't ever recall seeing the pictures for that.
I'd like to keep this focused on the history
Brainerd
of
Jones.
Petaluma
Okay.
and the history of the Women's Club.
Sure.
right.
Thank you.
Anything else about Brainerd Jones or some of the historical architecture in the town of Petaluma?
So, Brent, do you have information about his window treatments and, of course, our gorgeous sliding door treatment? Anything on his window treatment inspiration?
Not specifically, but I know that he used that as kind of a signature piece for him, for his work in doing interesting things with the windows that weren't common. As I pointed out earlier in the presentation, the high windows that face the street, that's a very unusual feature. And I think his interest there was to have the windows accentuate the angular shape of the roof. And it was also to bring light into the building, because craftsman style interiors are nice, but they tend to be dark. And although that can feel cozy in the wintertime, it can be a little bit off-putting other times of the year. And so by having that high natural light, that provided an opportunity to get as much light from that wall surface to as far back in the building as possible. And that's really critical. And this is where his thinking about the site-specific issues around that building is important. You don't have much distance between you and the property, next to the church on either side of you. And so since he wasn't able to balance having windows on multiple surfaces to the same degree that I'm sure he would have preferred, in order to maximize the natural lighting into that space, he did not only the normal band of windows at regular height, but the high windows. But as I mentioned earlier, he liked to do some interesting things with smaller windows by having X bracing in them and features that weren't necessary for the structure of the window, but added a little bit of extra character. And a good example of that, and I can't give you a specific address, but if you go on Petaluma Boulevard North, as you pass Oak Street and before you get to what used to be Redwood Glass, there is a house from the late teens, early 20s, and it has what's called a double roof dormer, and it has those interesting windows on it, on the roof. It's kind of a gray colored building.
Awesome. I mean, wasn't he known for windows and window treatment and porches and like lifestyle? Like for our building, we have these gorgeous glass sliding doors that separate the fireside room and go into the main room. I mean, like that, those sliding doors, beveled and all high, are exquisite. And I think that was part of what his inspiration was.
Well, the sliding door aspect is not uncommon. If you go in some of the houses, even from like late Victorian period, you will find that there's kind of a parlor, and the parlor usually opens up to an entryway or to a dining room, and they use, in this case, double pocket doors to separate the space, and it served two purposes. It was a way of opening the space up if you had, you know, a big social event, but you could also close the door off for two purposes. One was to provide privacy or sound, but also because heating houses was expensive back then, it wasn't infrequent. If you had a room that you weren't using, you would shut it off from the rest of the house so that you weren't having to heat up that space. I think what makes what you're talking about a little more unique is that he did it with glass doors, and I think that's more a feature that you see heading into the 20th century. It also provides a visual connection between the two rooms, even if they're physically separated by the doors.
Yes.
You hit the chat icon.
Who's talking? I can like highlight you. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. You have full speaking. Talk loud into your mic. Question? Or send it in the chat and Linda will help us. How are we doing in the chat? Well, we've got some thanks, Brent, for a very informative presentation. It was interesting to learn about other buildings in the Brainerd design. So we've got some really nice accolades here going on in the chat room. And Brent, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For all you know about Brainerd Jones, and then all you have incorporated into your own design work for the Petalumans.
Of yesteryear.
And Petalumans of yesteryear. But you are a current Brainerd Jones interior designer. You work with the clients on what they want, and you will, I'm most certainly, will give them the best design options. You hope they take the nice options of fitting into the block.
That's what you hope. No, I mean, the key thing to good design is a good contractor, a good architect, and a good client. And the key thing for the architect to do is to listen to the client so that he understands what they need. And then my philosophy is the architect acts as a facilitator. So, because every client's different.
You are Brainerd Jones reenacted. He did. Brainerd Jones was like that.
I think
he
so.
He wanted to have his integrity of the design of the season or the year, and yet he wanted to honor the women primarily and the men at that time. It's a really interesting subject, you know, and you've done well. And Rosemary Hart, by the way, PWC membership, Rosemary Hart hired Brent Jones, wait, I got you confused. Brent Russell, to do her craftsman style home. She took it down to the stud. She contacted Brent Russell to help her because Brainerd Jones had moved on to the ethereals. And so she asked Brent Russell to help her. And we all know Rosemary. She's got a most amazing craftsman home in the style. And Rosemary also helps us to look at the windows that need the window doors between the fireside and the main room. She's like, okay, we got to have the right pieces and parts for this to happen. And she's been on board for that, for the house and grounds, right, Lynn? And I'm thinking it's Nancy. That's
Yeah.
great.
We'll
It's
talk
just
later.
great.
Thank you, Carol.
She's awesome.
She showed you the way that we have to order this part. We have to have this piece of part ordered. You know, these doors are 100+ years old. They need to be refurbished. And we at the Women's Club are doing that.
Well, to Rosemary's credit, she picked out just about everything on the interior house, and she's got a very good sense of style and knowing what's appropriate. Second thing is she's an engineer by training, so she's very organized. But, you know, and also have compliments for Anne because she knew what she wanted in her house and she knew what worked. So, and she's very organized as well.
Very good, Brent.
And so, Brent, many of us are saying thank you so much. They're you know, having their dinner and having meetings and so on and so forth. So maybe we're going to close the meeting now, if that's okay with you folks. I think we've learned
that would be
a
up to
lot.
Sue.
We've enjoyed very much.
Yeah.
That
Thank
would
you,
be
Linda.
up to
Thank you so much for
Sue.
organizing.
It's been so interesting hearing everyone's questions. I hated to break in, but I think it's time to quit because a lot of people are signing off. But Brent, thank you so much. I loved hearing about what you had to say.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for Lynn Ann for taking my pictures and getting them up on the screen, and thank you for Linda Buffo for coordinating this.
Absolutely. Yes, our pleasure.
And it was a pleasure to see Ann again. I'm looking forward to seeing her in person one of these days.
Aren't we all? And thank you, Brent, for having the embodiedness of Brainerd Russell. I mean, Brainerd Jones. Sorry, Brainerd Russell. That's Brainerd Russell's your new tagline.
Okay, good night now.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you very, very much.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, all. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.